Sorry, I just want to make sure that I get unplugged. Thanks. Yeah. Perfect.
Get some candy. There's sparkling water too. Yeah, you can toss us candy like if you like what we say. Instead of applause, you can just throw candy. No. You don't like that? You can throw me the candy. Yeah, you can throw it. Okay.
As long as you throw it to you and not at it.
There's a Jewish tradition. There's a celebration of it's when you throw candy at the kids. If you're a bystander, you can get rid of the bruise. That's my reaction.
Yeah,
really. We just did that.
I love a good challenge to people, so I'm still happy to do that too.
You go right ahead.
We can bring the basket.
Okay. There's a whole system. How do we all know that? Can you hear us? Oh, if they can.
And then in the chat, they can tell us.
Hmm.
Oh, I can go to the link on my phone.
Would you do that? The sound isn't moving when I talk, which makes me think that the sound isn't. I give up. You know what I mean? For those of you who can see my face, hello. Yep, everything's on. It worked about 20 minutes ago, so this is just being annoying. On. Welcome. Grab some candy.
Candy and seltzer by the door if you'd like some.
There's your mic icon. Just turn on.
It's on when I click.
Yep, I can hear it.
You
Can
can?
you hear us?
Oh, delightful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how well they can. Let's do a little sound check really quick. If
Okay.
people could just quiet down and then the speakers could just do a mic check.
Okay.
We're testing the microphone to see if we can be heard on YouTube. Does that work? Testing
you hear
1, 2,
us?
3.
Keep talking.
Keep
Just keep
talking.
talking.
We're talking and we're saying fascinating and exciting things that everyone wants to hear. Very good. There's just a delay, but that's good. Yeah, I'm trying to. Okay. I'm trying to.
Great. Well, shall we get started?
You're fine. I'll just let you guys get seated. You're
Oh,
fine.
yeah.
You're fine. Just make yourself at home. Yeah. We're so glad to have you all here with us this evening. For those of you who are physically in the space of Uncorked Inspirations, thank you so much for hosting this. Yay. We're clapping. For those of you who will join us online, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. If you can't hear us, I don't know what to tell you, but I really hope you can. There are not comments available in this section, but feel free, if you want to go and have a discussion on Facebook. We have a group there. You may see people coming and going as folks enter. No big deal. It's fine. This is a casual sit-down conversation among friends, so we welcome that. I would love to open us with a word of prayer if you would join me. Gracious Creator who calls us to be mindful of our neighbor, we ask that you are with us in conversation, that you fill this space with intentionality, with our full minds and hearts, and that we might have a conversation that allows us and encourages us to be present to the ways that we are involved in political conversations, and how our faith, how our call, and how the energy in the world moves so that we might truly be best neighbor to one another. All these things we ask in the spirit that breathes in spaces. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you guys for the question. Hi everybody, my name is Isabel. I'm the LaCroix.
Too, but you open that right on up.
Yeah.
You follow the instructions.
No, I followed the instructions.
We have some different
So BYO, or help yourself to LaCroix over there. Welcome everybody. So I'm gonna get started by sharing our ground rules and sort of the spirit that we have in gathering together, and then we'll do some introductions. So we're hosting this conversation because our faith calls us to engage politically around our values. And we care about issues, but we also care about the dialogue itself. So how we engage in this conversation is just as important as what we say. In my own faith tradition, we believe that everyone has inherent worth, everyone has the capacity to seek truth, and we all have a responsibility to work together across cultures and backgrounds to build a peaceful world. So to support those goals in our conversation, we ask that you listen and respond attentively. Later in our Q&A, weigh your words before speaking. Remember that others may have personal and profound experiences that will affect how they hear what you say. Respect one another's time and space, speak briefly and to the topic. And we'll have time for that conversation after we do some talking. So let's do some brief introductions, and then Margaret will start us off.
I'm Melissa Atchison. I pastor the Mennonite congregation in Manhattan.
I'm Margaret McGhee. I'm an Episcopal priest here in town.
I'm Miriam Edelman. I'm a member of Manhattan Jewish Congregation. I'm Caela Simmons Wood, and I'm the pastor at First Congregational United Church of Christ.
My name is Christian Watkins, and I'm the campus pastor and director at Ecumenical Campus Ministries at Kansas State, or ECM.
How are we doing on volume? Do we need to speak louder? Yes? Okay, we
Yeah.
will project.
We had a sound system snafu, so
And it
we're.
So did I.
So I want to start us off by talking a little bit about why we're here, and maybe particularly personally why I'm here. There is a small but growing number of voices right now that are starting to claim a label that used to be seen as something not to be proud of, which is Christian nationalist. A new book came out today with that title, Arguing for Christian Nationalism. And as a Christian who sees the role of Christianity in public life somewhat differently, I feel some obligation to talk about that, to say that that voice is not the only voice in the public sphere. I wish we could not talk about politics at all, but there are times when I think we have to as people of faith, and we're not all Christians here, but I think recognizing that there are multiple voices is an important thing, and respecting those voices, that's a part of my faith, doing that. I'm also a lawyer. I haven't practiced law for a long time, but I think it's important. A lot of people these days are saying that the Constitution is a Christian document. And I'm pretty sure, based on being both a lawyer and a priest, that that isn't true. The one way in which I think it is true is that it recognizes that people can't always be trusted to do the right thing. That it sets up a balance of powers to say, okay, yes, people are going to act in their own self-interest. So we're going to set up this separation of powers, executive branch, judicial branch, legislative branch, two houses of Congress, federalism, states and federal government, so that no one group takes over everything. And one of the things that's happening right now that I'm seeing are some efforts to undermine that system, to really take away, to change the balance of powers. One of the ways in which that's happening, particularly, so it's happening everywhere in terms of gerrymandering, in terms of rules that make voting more difficult. Those are trying to do that, I think. In Kansas right now, we have some ballot initiatives that would amend the state constitution to change the balance of power. The First Amendment that's on the ballot would say a lot of the power that the governor has will now be in the hands of the state legislature. There's an effort to recall judges, which reduces the power of the judiciary over the state legislature. And those are things that, to me, undermine the system in which we talk about all of these things, the system in which we recognize the voices of everyone, recognize the dignity of every human being, which again, to me, is a theological position. So that's why I'm here. And I think that's the broader picture in which we're having these conversations. Everyone else is going to talk about specific issues, but I think it's all happening in that context where we need to be paying attention to the system. And so that, I think that's about all was there anything else I was supposed to say? Okay. So
I'm starting my timer because I couldn't see that down there.
okay.
I get it. So again, I'm Caela. Hi. And as Margaret said, some of us are going to talk a little bit about issues that are near and dear to our hearts. And I'm going to share about 2 issues that my faith informs when I go and mark my ballots. I'm going to speak louder. So the first one is LGBTQ equality. And I have to say that this is one that for me, it's been an area of passion for me for about 20 years. And I came to it really from an area of intersectionality because I was raised in a family and in a faith tradition that I would describe as feminist, where I was taught that as a girl, as a woman, I had full equality, that I should be able to, break out of a box and do whatever I wanted to do with my life. And yet at the same time was flawed because like when I told my Sunday school teacher when I was in high school that I wanted to go to seminary, she said, are you sure that it wasn't God calling your husband or my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, to ministry instead? And he said, my now husband said he was certain that it was not. that was not. So, I mean, like on one hand, I grew up in a church that taught me that I could be a pastor, and on the other hand, there were still these forces, right? So I was kind of chafing at these. And over time, I really came to understand, I've always understood God, the God that I have learned about through the Bible and through my faith tradition, to be a pretty radical feminist. And that one of the highest values that I hold is that God creates us to be the fullest versions of ourselves that we can possibly be. And anything that kind of boxes us in or says, no, you can only be this or that because of the color of your skin or because of this identity or because of your gender is not good. And over time, I came to understand that that was exactly what is happening to LGBTQ people, like on multiple levels. And so when I was in my early 20s, I had a pretty radical mystical experience when I was in a worship service. And I won't go into all the details, but we were taking communion and I really heard like a voice say in my heart, like, this is what the kingdom of God looks like. And I was in a church that was very diverse with a lot of LGBTQ families, people going forward for communion. And there was nothing after that that ever would have convinced me that LGBTQ people aren't fully equal and beloved by God. And so in the 2 decades since then, I've really come to understand a lot from being a pastor alongside a lot of LGBTQ people that queer folks have so much to teach us, those of us who aren't queer, about resilience and about strength and about faithfulness and about dedication and about a desire to be exactly what I was talking about earlier, which is being the fullest version of yourself you were created to be without letting society tell you you have to fit inside a box. We, as I'm sure you probably all know, we're living through a really scary, painful time for LGBTQ people, especially youth who are coming up and trying to find their way in the world. On one hand, we've made great strides. We are in a very different place now with the inclusion of LGBTQ folks than we were 20 years ago. But with those strides, like marriage equality and a greater general acceptance, has of course come this backlash. And so then now we see all of these issues that come up every single cycle in legislatures, both in Kansas and in the federal government and in lots of other places where we're having to deal with things like bathroom bills for transgender folks and school sports bills for transgender folks and reproductive rights, healthcare rights being limited, critical race theory bans in schools. All of these things, many of them are tied to the issue of LGBTQ equality. And so when I go to the
ballot and when I look at candidates, I am always looking at that. And I'm trying to look for coded language that might lead me to believe that someone is not going to be advocating for LGBTQ equality or is going to be trying to limit rights of people based on their identities. So that kind of leads into a second area of concern for me, which is public education. Like I said, a lot of those things that we're talking about with LGBTQ equality are conversations about children and are conversations about schools. And we've seen this in Kansas as well. Like now I know in my kids' schools, they can't ask the kids questions, they can't survey kids without getting parental permission because there are concerns about like, oh, are we going to be asking kids what their pronouns are? And then we're going to magically like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden now they're transgender kids because we asked them what their pronouns were, which is not at all how that works. But it's part of a wider attack on public education. I mean, we oftentimes, I think, will look and say like, don't they understand we're going to destroy the public schools if we keep going down this route? If we continue to undermine administrators and teachers and make it harder for people to teach, they're going to leave. Yes, that's the goal. I mean, I ultimately believe that for many politicians, that is the goal, to destroy that foundational aspect of our culture, which for me as a person of faith is really problematic because not just on a personal level, because I'm the product of public schools, but I'm the product of public schools that were great because they were diverse, because they were places where I regularly learned from and came into contact with people who had different life experiences than me, different ways of understanding the world than I did, taught me things that I wouldn't have ever learned at home or in my own little bubble. And in order for our democracy to work, we have to have people in schools where they are encountering people on a regular basis who are pushing them to understand the world in a different way. Additionally, as a Christian, I mean, Jesus really loved children, right? But like we have songs about it. Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. And that doesn't mean Jesus loves my kids as a mom. It means Jesus loves all the kids. And it means that as adults, all adults have the mandate to care for children and to make sure that all children have access to strong public education and the care that they need to blossom and become the people that the Creator made them to be. So when I'm going to the ballot, I am looking at all of those issues, and I'm not just looking at the issue of like, are we funding public education, but also, are you trying to make it hard for my kids' teachers to stay teachers? Are you pushing this anti-CRT stuff? Are you dealing with these, talking about sports bills and bathroom bills and those kinds of things? Like all of those things that I need to look at.
Right, sorry.
It's you.
I'm not good at remembering. As Jan knows, who plays Mahjong with me, I can never remember the order. So I lived in England for a long time. And British people always wanted me to explain certain things about America, some of which was easy enough, like why we spell color without a U and what exactly are grits. But
I make very good grits.
I believe that.
I'm at your house for breakfast. One of the things that I could never explain and will never be able to explain is the way that we have taken the Second Amendment and turned it into an idol at whose altar we worship with a shocking and appalling and unique level of human sacrifice. Judaism has two specific values I wanted to talk about that are well, it has many values, but two of the most important values in our belief system. The first is pikuach nefesh, which means the preservation of life. To the extent that you are not allowed to do things that would endanger others or yourself. And putting a stumbling block in front of people to hurt them or to put them in danger is specifically not okay. Someone who takes a life, it's as though they have destroyed the universe, and one who saves a life, it is as though they have saved the entire universe. We're also obliged not to stand idly by while blood is being shed. And that one should not sell to dangerous people weapons or things that they could use to hurt other people. So this is very ancient. What I quoted here is from the Talmud, which is from the codified around the early centuries of the current millennia, of the current time, and from the Torah, from the Bible itself. The second value I wanted to bring up as a context for this is the value of justice, tzedek. which is a very high value in Judaism. People are considered righteous even if they're not Jewish, even if they don't do any of the other commandments, if they keep a particular set of 7 rules that are called the Noahide commandments. And one of the most important is that people will set up a system of justice, of fair laws. And I mention this in particular because one of the other amendments on the Kansas ballot is one that proposes to change the way or codify the way that individual counties in Kansas will select their sheriffs. And it sounds pretty innocuous, but the whole point of the reason that that measure is on the ballot is to make one particular person who is being investigated above the law, which is something that is contradictory to Judaism and contradictory to all of our moral principles. Which is why everyone is encouraged to consider that in your voting decisions. Now, the United States stands alone if you look at developed countries in the level of gun violence. And we barely think about life-changing injuries and all the other rest of it. We're just talking about gun death here. 49,000 gun deaths in 2021, and that has been steadily rising. That's 14.8 deaths per 100,000 people. We felt that COVID was a problem when we were over 20 deaths per 100,000. But we're willing to put up with this every day. Huge cost of GDP, of productivity, and of how much it costs us to enforce those laws, of the extra cost for law enforcement because they have to deal with the risk of the guns all the time, of the loss of life, all the rest of it. And let us also point out that when we talk about gun deaths, we're not only talking about homicides. We're also talking about the accidents, which is a fairly small proportion, but the number of children every year who are killed by accident or by having access to unlocked, unstored weapons. And of course, 60% of gun deaths are suicides. And a suicide is, as you would expect, a great deal more likely, you're 40 times more likely to succeed if there's a gun in the house. And then there's also the consequences for domestic violence. 4.6 million children live in a home with an unsecured weapon. And when we talk about Kansas, Kansas has some of the weakest gun laws in the country. It is considered a national failure. And there are a number of legislative proposals to try and impose some common sense gun regulations, which all failed in 2022. And let me contrast that for you, having lived in the United Kingdom for a long time, with what happens in the UK, which is that, remember, we had a gun violence rate in America of 14.8. In Kansas, it's 16.9 gun deaths per 100,000 people.
And how frequently? Like
Per year, sorry. All of this is per annum. The 14.8 was in 2021. I believe the last numbers for Kansas were a year behind, so it might even be worse. In the United Kingdom, their gun death rate and this is from 2022, was 0.24 per 100,000. That makes the rate in the United States 61 times. You're 61 times more likely to experience gun violence than in the United Kingdom. 70 times more than in Kansas. 70 times more in Kansas than in the UK. And bear in mind that you can have a gun in the United Kingdom. Lots of people have guns, lots of people hunt, but you have to have permits. There are background checks. There are waiting periods. You have to store it in a particular way. And in fact, the police come to your house on a regular basis. I don't know if it's annually or every few years to make sure that you're locking them up properly. So there are common sense gun regulations that are completely compatible with our Constitution and the Second Amendment that would save lives. And what can we do? Well, we can have extreme risk protection orders that will protect people, either people who are a danger to themselves or others, domestic violence, suicide risks, people who should not have a gun, and all of that with judicial protections, universal background checks, waiting periods, banning assault weapons, storage regulations, all of those things are possible. Many of those proposals are dying in the Kansas legislature. So from our shared values of protecting life and implementing justice that applies to all of us, no vigilantes, a proper system of justice, we must consider this at our ballot box.
Thank you, Miriam. Yes, it matters who we vote for, and it matters what rules we're setting for how the decisions are made. This election really matters. We got pretty energized over the summer for the special election in August. So I'm going to talk just briefly about abortion. I know people have thought about it already, but I wanted to point your attention to a letter signed by interfaith clergy across Kansas. There's this idea that Christians oppose abortion, or that religious people oppose abortion, and over 60 religious leaders here in the state signed a letter saying, no, we support abortion rights. There's a link to this letter in our Facebook event, so you can check it out. But basically it says, many faiths and people of faith support access to reproductive health care, including abortion. And our religious traditions teach us that all people have dignity and worth, and that we have a particular responsibility to care for those who are most vulnerable. And that's what I'm hearing and what everybody is saying here, that caring for the most vulnerable. And I know that feels like one of the main things we're voting on this month is, do we care about the vulnerable people and their agency to make decisions about their own lives and the people who are structuring their lives through legal decisions. And I guess I'll just say personally, being new to Kansas over the summer when the amendment was still undecided, it was pretty shocking to me to realize that so many of my neighbors were considering laws that would mandate my intimacy with an unwanted pregnancy, that I could be the victim of a violent crime and be mandated to carry that pregnancy to term. Walking around town knowing that potentially a majority of people believed that that was a fine state for me to be in was shocking. And so it's reassuring that that amendment was turned down, but only by 60%, wow, I still feel that. So I'm grateful for my religious community and for my relationship with my higher power. I know that my agency is a central component of my creativity in the world and the care that I give to the world. It matters that I have agency in how I choose to do that. And so yeah, this propels me in how I vote. So yeah, we wanted to open it up to the other folks sitting at our table if you had any thoughts or questions.
So I guess I'm thinking about you all that are present in the room and the ones on Zoom who had enough energy to put some time into what we feel is very important right now. And it's obvious to me that you probably know dozens of people that don't have the energy, that are experiencing overwhelm in general. So I'm curious about what this panel could say about inspiring others, right? How could we encourage the people that we know well enough to talk about these things, or even that we would like to get to know better? How can we inspire them to vote for someone who maybe doesn't have a vote, to vote for somebody who is vulnerable?
I think one thing that can be useful particularly for people who are Christians, is having some religious language behind that, because there's so much religious language on the other side. And I think it's important to remember to be able to say, look, Jesus invited people to follow him. He didn't hold a gun to their heads. It was an invitation. It was never something that was compelled. When followers left him, and they did, he let them go. That's in the Bible. He said, love your neighbors, care for the poor and the widow and the orphan. I may be quoting Abraham Lincoln there rather than scripture, but the concept is the same. but it's and so I think and I think it's important to remember he was killed by the political and religious powers of his day. He wasn't really a part of them, and so those are all things that are. Sometimes having some of that language can be a helpful thing. Yes. But just
I think that's such a good question. I hear you asking a question of fatigue. Mm-hmm. I hear you asking a question of hope. And I don't know if I have a good answer. I think that my phone keeps ringing and it's driving me nuts. They're political phone calls. That's fine. I think that, I work a lot with college students and young folks, and I see sort of both, right? I see a lot of fatigue. The question, why am I still fighting for my right to an abortion? Why am I still trying to have the same kinds of access to healthcare that my parents had? That's a fatiguing question. It's a confusing question. I think too, one of the moments that has been most interesting for me, I think it was you that was sharing about your beautiful child that said, Mom, I realize that the adults don't really know what's going on. And I really think that's kind of what's happening in this moment, right? That we're sort of looking around and realizing, who are the adults in the room? What does that mean? Really taking that seriously. So I know that question of hope, that question of fatigue is really present with young people. And there's a lot of anxiety around how to be engaged correctly, right? And I think that part of that fatigue is from feeling like churches or faith communities are telling folks that they can't follow their intuition and instinct, that they have to sort of go against that and say, I don't want to support white nationalism. And we see people leaving faith communities because of that. And so what I hear us talking about today is really holding that tension and recognizing that this question of fatigue is real. And we're all tired. I think all of us in this room are tired in some capacity of asking, why are we still doing this? But I also think that what I hear at this panel and why I participate in these conversations is that we have hope with one another, right? And that we still have communities and people that are looking for hope and are trying to find that in themselves and in one another. And so I think that both of those things are happening at the same time in this election. And regardless of the outcome, right? Like sometimes we're going to lose some of these conversations that were happening in real ways. We still can find people that see hope in us. And I see that in working with college students. So I don't know if I have a good answer to that, but I really hear that tension. And I think we all experience that. Where do we find that? So you may have a better answer at that question. But gosh, it really resonated with me. It really resonated with me.
Thanks, Gretchen.
Yeah. I'm gonna turn my phone off now.
I wanted to add one other thing that I didn't say before, which we hear a lot about the whole gun violence thing, is that it's really a mental health issue. And our provision of mental health in this country, like most of our healthcare, is shocking. Yes, negatives. It's not that much better in Britain. And just to be clear about this, I lived in Britain for a long time. They're not smarter than we are. They're not more mentally healthy and less crazy. They're not less violent. they're not wealthier or more educated or any of the things. It's just the guns and the control of the guns. And I think that we forget that in the whole American exceptionalism, that things don't have to be the way they are. And I think that's part of the hope of being able to realize that things don't have to be the way other people say they are, the way they've always been.
I wanted to speak to the fatigue,
Yes.
if I might speak to the fatigue. Like about 5 or so years ago, I started doing almost all of my grocery shopping at Aldi. And the reason I bring that up is because when you go to Aldi, there's like one kind of peanut butter. And like if you want crackers, there's like a kind of crackers, right? Like there's a kind of bananas. Maybe there's like bananas and organic bananas, right? But like that's it. And I found that so liberating because I was so tired of like going to like giant grocery stores and having 6,000 types of peanut butter to choose from and having to like compare the prices and which one's on sale. Like it all be like, if you want peanut butter, like this is it. This is what you're getting. And I say that just to say that I think as a culture, we have reached a point with an absolutely overwhelming amount of information. And I say that as a person who really loves information. But I think one of the things that leads to the fatigue is overconsumption of the news cycle, and then also wherever else you're getting any of that, like whether it be from social media, Twitter, whatever. Sometimes I was thinking about this in terms of like people being not sure how to vote, or like if the amount of information out there is so overwhelming, you don't even know where to begin to get educated to then make a decision. It's just it's like going to the grocery store and having 60,000 kinds of peanut butter. You just don't even know where to start. And where this kind of connects with me, especially as a person of faith, is that when the world is that loud, it really does become like I need spiritual practices to ground me and help me learn how to shut all of that out. Not that I'm not advocating that you not be informed, right? Like, of course we all need to be informed, but like the point of information is to empower us to act. And most of us have way more information than we need to act. We can cut it down to like this much and still make a good decision, make our decision. And so just to say, I think thinking a lot about how much, because the world is very, very noisy. And the default is if you have your ears on, you are just going to be inundated. And so being really, really strategic about what we say yes to and what we say no to in terms of what information we take in, and recognizing that that's a daily battle that you have to wage.
Are you thinking that our values need to be kind of a filter for some of that?
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking, Miriam, but I didn't say it. Perfect. Yes, absolutely. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and I think also there's something in limiting how much we're hearing. There's a phrase called doom scrolling.
Yeah.
If you're on social media, you just sit there at 2:00 in the morning and you keep scrolling. I do it a lot. It's not spiritually healthy. It's just not. But I think,
Please God, there's no gun in the house because it's prime candidate for sitting up.
right. But it's but I think finding a few, and another thing I stopped doing a couple of years ago is I don't watch video news because seeing it's too much all the time. I read a lot of reputable media in print. So I am well informed, but watching it in video for me is just too much. There's too much emotional connection, so I'm not able to be objective, and I'm also, it's overwhelming and stressful. And so I think that's something that, again, just trying to keep that balance. I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, you can also have a buddy.
Yes.
And spiritual community is a great place to find your buddies for getting informed. It's easier to sit down at a computer and look up candidates, when you're on a laptop next to somebody else doing the same thing. And also checking in the news with somebody else, or having, you can call it a spiritual practice if you want, but setting an intention before looking at the news about why you're doing it and how long you're going to do it. Yeah. And then I think this is also a good moment for a public service announcement with the thinking about the inundation of information and choices. Kathy sitting here is reminding me, I learned from the League of Women Voters that our ballot is really long this time.
28 pages.
28 pages.
Wow.
So we're expecting long
Take candy
lines.
with you.
We're expecting long lines. Most of it is judges.
And who knows who the judges are?
Well, yeah.
Did you?
But
So
let me
no,
make my
well,
point,
Yeah,
which
that's
is
good.
that you can vote early. That will be a good way to avoid waiting in a long line.
Yeah, and I'm going to be working as a poll worker, and at the training, one of the things they told us was to be very careful to make sure that you actually scroll down to the bottom of each page, read the buttons, make sure you know what you're doing on each page, because it is a very long ballot. And, yeah.
And to
And-
preview
and
your ballot before you go. I mean, that's one thing now that we have the internet, like I always try to preview my ballot before I go, because it never fails. There's something I didn't know about.
Yeah.
You can print off a ballot and
Right.
bring it with
How,
you.
how
It's
many
not
of us
a
here have
museum.
already voted?
Me?
Yay, good job.
What was the question?
Did you already
How
vote?
many of us have already voted?
Only one.
Only one.
You raised both.
And to answer your question about, I would actually like to come back to the judges for just a moment. I was talking about systemic threats, ways, attempts to change the balance of powers. This ties back into the issue of abortion and the referendum in August. There are plenty of faithful positions on abortion. It's a difficult and complicated ethical, moral, theological issue. But what's happening with the judges, I think, is an effort to, in a back channel way, to change the outcome of that referendum. So it's a systemic thing. It's saying, let's recall the current judges so we can get new ones. Because right now, what's supporting the right to abortion in Kansas is a judicial decision saying that there is a state constitutional right to abortion.
Yes.
And
I didn't know any of them, and if they were incumbents,
Right.
and I hadn't heard anything terrible
yeah,
about them.
so right,
Yes.
and I think and I think that's why I don't love every federal judge, but I do like the fact that they have lifetime tenure, because for better or worse, that gives them some political independence. It gives them some independence from the political system. I don't love the decisions they all make, but I think it's better than the alternative of constant political pressure. So, and that's really what the recall election of judges is trying to do, is to reduce their independence, I think.
That's so helpful.
Yeah.
That's helpful reframe.
Right.
That's another thing Brits don't understand. Why are you electing your judges?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if we're gonna have to, then let's make sure that they have as much independence as possible.
Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah,
Great.
We talk about limiting our news sources
Mhm.
and turning off the noise. What if people are limiting to news sources that are not reliable?
Well, I would not recommend that.
But
Yeah.
how do we approach that with people that we care about who might be relying on news sources that are?
Okay,
Absolutely.
and so the question is, how do we interact with people? What do we say to people who are limiting their news sources to what we consider to be unreliable sources? It's hard. I'm not sure there's an answer. I can tell you that what I do is point to something that is leaning in the same direction, but more objective. So if someone is super conservative, instead of reading right-wing media, I would say read the Wall Street Journal, okay? Liberals are gonna disagree with a lot of what the Wall Street Journal says, but they're not lying. The facts for there's what we used to call spin. But, and the same thing on the left, it's probably better to be reading the New York Times than MSNBC. Again, because those are sources that are that's maybe left-leaning, but it's factual. And Wall Street Journal is maybe right-leaning, but it's factual. And that's the best I've been able to come up with.
Here's the follow-up question. How do you get people to understand that some things are true and some things are not true?
Oh, epistemology
This
conversation.
alternative fact thing. It's a
Yeah.
real problem.
We could do a whole panel.
If you figure that out.
I'll just throw that out.
Yeah, it's hard and it's frustrating, and and I think where I'm holding to hope on this is that there are certainly people on the extremes, but I don't think there's a majority of people on the extremes. I think there's a majority that's willing to listen and look at evidence, whatever they might be right or left leaning, but they actually care about truth. They actually, I think there's probably a majority of people in this country who think there's such a thing as a fact. I think.
Well,
They're not the loudest
This
voices.
is the first time we've had a question here where actually I have some expertise here since I'm not a clergy person.
Yeah, you do.
Please.
Yes.
I'm an organizational psychologist.
Yeah, you know
Yes.
about this.
So there's two things to say about this. And the first one is that arguing about whether something is true or not is rarely a productive way of doing this. What we know works in persuasion, and there's some very interesting stuff out there about how people are politically persuaded, is first of all, personal stories. So your personal experience, not this is what is true or this is what it says in the Wall Street Journal versus MSNBC, whatever, but your personal experience of these things and your personal feelings about it. And secondly, using that or other techniques to open a door to a possibility. So not you are wrong and I am right, but can you imagine a possibility that there are other ways of looking at this? So opening those kinds of doors of possibility with somebody who disagrees with you or doesn't see facts or seems not to care about facts, well, is it possible that, that there might be another way of looking at that?
I think I see with young people
Thank you. No, that was
a
good.
move away from
Better than my
social
answer.
media. I think that's important to understand, that there is a trend that's coming that maybe we're not seeing in older generations, but there's a move away from social media where people don't understand and recognize that getting information from those places is toxic and bad. If we look at sort of the statistics of Facebook, the demographics that are using some of these places are not under 20. You know what I mean? And so I think we have to really look at the mirror of, when people say, who are using these social media spaces? It's people that are older, and being really honest and truthful with that. So I mean, for me, that I don't necessarily want to say the hope is young people because that seems a little trite, but I do think that there's a savvy and there's a knowledge that that there is poisoning happening in these spaces and that we're moving away from real conversation. And so I would encourage you to talk with younger folks about what sort of spaces they're engaged in, why they choose to do or not do certain things, because I think you'll find them to be mentors in how we're engaging with one another online. It's really a space that they thrive in. And so this question of post-truth is an interesting perspective when you start talking about someone who's 18 and thinking about what they're consuming and what they're not consuming. And I see a lot of changes coming because of working with those types of demographics. So I would encourage you to talk with people who are younger than you and to ask them and take them as experts in these kinds of questions about how to engage on social media, because they're pretty savvy about it.
Here's a question.
There's a site that I learned about through the league that is called, you can Google the media bias chart.
Yeah.
It's really for that point that you made of guiding somebody toward a more reputable source. So instead of looking at One American News, they might be more comfortable looking at this site. And they have a new one that comes out every month. It's based on social science. and was in published papers. Now I think there's a company that owns it, but it is a
But it's still
really-
research-based
Yeah.
every year.
Yes, and it really is a good place when you want to guide people who may have a particular perspective, but they need more accurate information. And it ranks from really inaccurate biases and sort of guides people to ones that may fit their views, but it's not full of lies.
Well, right, and, and I think it's important that we say, look, people are going to have different political views, and that's okay. But we need to respect one another. Well, my first priority is to preserve the system in which we have these debates.
Yes.
And because I think that's really critical. And then having respectful conversations, that actually talk about and address facts is also, and personal stories and all of that is really my goal. More than, I care about all of these issues, but more than winning on these particular issues, it's really maintaining that environment which we can continue to talk.
I went to this site by the League of Women Voters, vote411.org, and found it extremely helpful to view all of the things on the ballot. Because if you walk into to vote,
Oh, yeah.
it's just too much to try. And then there are people in line, and they're wanting to get in. So if you go to the site and look at the candidates,
Yeah.
and look at the constitutional voting and the judges, I went in more informed than I've ever been.
That's great.
So,
Well done.
but the interesting thing is, I put it on social media, and I got one like.
And that's okay.
That's just wonderful.
That's
Got
okay.
one. Got one.
But, that's,
And who knows who else saw it and didn't like it? You don't, like
Right.
everything else we do, it's a drop of water in the pond, and probably other people scrolled past it, didn't like it, but it'll stick in their brain. You never know.
And that's a great example, likes don't matter. Like, if we're, and then not to be trite again, but like, if we're basing our self-worth on whether someone likes or doesn't like something, we're going to miss the big picture. And so I think that's important to remember, that we're talking about sort of how our moral compass, not that immediate gratification, and we can't fall victim to that. That like
I think it
machines.
indicates though an interest. I could put an animal, killing another animal, and eating it, and I'd probably get 20.
Right.
And so there is a place where we're all so tired of this political thing. And the last president we had actually had a huge religious following, which has always bothered me. And then we have a bunch of leaders who attest to being religious and who lie every time they speak. I'm wondering where the responsibility of their church is to hold them accountable. If they're going to say in other words, if a guy in Mississippi says, I will not marry a black and white woman, he's not an island of himself. There is a huge group of people backing him, egging him on, telling him, well, we're not going to tolerate this either. And so we have a political system right now where this man and his evil, with all the religions involved, divided all of us. And to the point where we let 1 million people die through the illness that we just went through, and we're still going through. And I'm not seeing, maybe I'm just not seeing it because I don't go to church, but what it seems to me like is that these people are not being held accountable by their other members of the churches, their priests. They're just rolling with all these lies and these really bad behaviors. But then they're Christians.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's happening is the churches are as siloed as everything else. You know, most churches are pretty uniform within the church of how they see the world. You know, the church where I am is different in that sense. It is politically divided. And I see that as an opportunity that we can actually see ourselves as part of a community, respect one another, and maybe have some of these hard conversations. It's terrifying, but I do think it's an opportunity. But it's, I think, that's one of the reasons I think we're doing this today, is to say there's not just one Christian voice on a lot of these issues. There really isn't, but sometimes it seems that way.
I feel like there's.
Yeah, I'm going to lead with a personal story. For several years, I vote with paper and pen, and I never have to wait. Last time I was down there, there was a long line of people waiting for those machines. They're supposed to be so nice and handy and quick. I was done way before they were. And, you know, a piece of paper, in this case, front and back, you know, about this long. It's much more discreet than a screen that just goes on and on and on and on. I like that. I like paper. I'm sort of old-fashioned that way. And I like that stubby little thing you can put in your finger, you know, called a pencil or a pen. And, you know, the little oval, that's just dumb simple, and I can do it.
Yeah.
So that's my personal story.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Did you want to share? I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah.
You need to be cut off.
I like that. I mean, it makes it into a practice, and the practice of voting. I was going to say about accountability, what keeps me hopeful is to be in community with people who are committed to accountability. You know, we keep it alive. I think there's a lot more potential for accountability in our larger systems, of course, but we can be the seed library for, the systems of our future if we're practicing different ways of accountability in our friends and in our religious communities. We still know how to do it.
I wanted to bring up, that was one of the most impressive documents I've ever seen that you visited on early on, where the churches all came together and signed off on this abortion issue.
Yeah.
I was just so impressed by that.
It's, one of the cool things about this crisis is that it's getting us talking across differences. It's brought us together, and religious leaders, throughout Kansas are talking to each other. The Kansas Interfaith Action is a great organization that I look to, especially being new to Kansas, to what should I think about all these issues? Where can I get more information?
If I can put in a tiny plug for KIPA, they haven't, I don't know the details yet, but their executive director, Rabbi Moti Reber, he's going to be here on November the 20th because he's speaking at our church in the morning, but then later that day, KIPA, which is Kansas Interfaith Action, is doing some kind of community some kind of open event that people can come to later in the day. So follow them if you don't follow them already to get updates. But yeah, they're so helpful, especially when it comes to local Kansas issues. It's with the overwhelm of information. I know I can trust them from a faith perspective. And I know that if they say it's time to write letters, it's time to call your representative, it's time to show up at the Capitol, then it's time. I don't have to go wading through 16,000 different news sources to figure out what I'm supposed to be working on. If Keitha tells me it's time for us to do this, I'm okay, I trust you. Because I have a real relationship with the people and the people on the board. And I, not that I'm just blindly doing whatever they say, but I know that I can trust where they're getting their information from, and that's really helpful.
I think with the fatigue, I think it's important to remember that if people like us raise our voices and act, there are more of us than there are of them.
Yes.
And I think to alleviate the fatigue, we need to get up every morning and say, there are more good people who are following their religious values or whatever values, who are trying to do better things. And But the key to it is that we must continue to get up every morning and act. So today I spent my 2.5 hours at Democratic headquarters. You know, I didn't do anything, but people came in and I talked to them and I was present.
And people see.
You know, I am allergic to phone calls, and so I don't do phone banks because I want to throw up if I have to make a list of phone calls. And I don't do social media, even though I'm 73. I've never been on Facebook.
Listen, you and the 17
But we have one sermon a year at the synagogue. And for 46 years, Miriam's dad did this sermon. And he was much more scholarly than I. But I have tried to stand in his shoes for the last 6 years, 5 years. And for the last, most of that time, I get up there and I think I'm not supposed to be political because it's the synagogue. And so I try really hard. But so this year I said, I'm not being political, I'm being historical. And I talked about events and things that have happened. But at the end I said, we have to find ways that we can act. And I listed 6 or 8. You can vote, you can volunteer, you can be knowledgeable, you know, you can do things, you can talk to people, you can be where people are. And I said, interestingly, my last comment was, I have hope that we can overcome the society that is developing around us. But in order to make that happen, we have to get up every morning and do something.
I think a follow-up to that, if I could. We've recently had, so I work with an organization and disability inclusion is our gig. That means it's an intersectionality. Like, you can't do just that. And in this political climate, it impacts some of our work. And we've had a few people that we've had to have hard conversations with. And one of my colleagues was really struggling with it. And so our conversation was about, we have to respond from the place of our values, not from theirs. And so I think a piece of that too is remembering in those moments and on those days and through the fatigue, these are my values, these are my beliefs. And to sit in a place where you can listen to a person who is probably polar opposite, hear that, but then going back to those relations, like, where is that common ground? Or I hear your words, this is what you said, let me share this. But we have to do it not from that place of making them believe what we believe, but honoring they have a different belief system, because I honor the different belief systems here. They align nicely with mine. But like, we've been having to practice that, especially with some of our less seasoned people. How do you hear those things, hold your values, and respond from a place of respect for others, even if they're not showing you respect? And I think that's part of why we get so tired. Because But there's a lot of insight in that focus on values, because I think one thing that people who are diametrically opposed on a lot of issues can agree on are we can recognize the validity of each other's values. Now, we may be prioritizing different values than others. You know, one person may be, you know, prioritizing individual self-determination. Another might be prioritizing law and order, but we can all agree that those are values, that those are maybe good things. It's just which comes first. And it can be a place for conversation, connection.
One of the things for me that's been really healing is acknowledging when I'm angry, acknowledging when I'm sad, and to find people that will do that with me. Because I feel like one of the things that happens is this toxic sort of positivity model where we're just like, we can do it, we can do it, we can do it, you know, and just like,
But sometimes we can't.
Like, you know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Oh, I know.
Sometimes you can't. And so for me, and I said this during our last conversation, it's finding people to be sad with.
Yeah.
It's finding communities to laugh with. It's finding people who will meet me where I'm at, because then I can extend that to someone else. And I think if we are only looking for the solution, we're still falling into a pitfall of not being in a relationship. And so, and I have to also be in relationship with myself in the midst of this. So I think for me, the healing piece of this is that these people at this table are incredible, you know, and I know that when I'm sad, I can call somebody here and be sad with them. They'll be sad with me. I think that's an incredible gift to give other people, that I'm not trying to make them something different. I'm not trying to make me something different. I'm just trying to sit and really hold whatever space needs to be held. And I think that's really the power of good faith community.
Yes.
That we're able to hold that with one another so that we can then in turn extend that love, I hear you saying love, to other people who may not agree with us. So we have to sort of have that model for us too.
Yeah.
And that's what I hear. That's what this is brought up for me.
We're past an hour. Should
Oh,
we go ahead and wrap up the
That
formal
seems like
portion of
such
this?
a good place.
Yeah.
To wrap.
Oh, okay.
And I think some of us can stay if you want to have informal conversations, I think, but I don't want everyone to feel captive here. So.
Thank you to everyone online who joined us. I can't see the numbers, but we're so glad that you're here. Thanks to folks who came in sincerity or confusion or sadness or joy. All of those things are welcome in this space. And I'm so excited, yes.
We have, if you look on our Facebook event, there's a link to a document there where some of the resources that were shared tonight for more information, you can find them there. Information about the resources, election resources. And I also wrote down the media bias chart so you can see that without remembering it. If you'd like to leave a donation for Uncorked Inspiration, we would love to support them for hosting, thank them for hosting us tonight. There's a basket there and a Venmo handle.
And you can also support them by telling all of your friends to come here and paint pottery and
And there's
sip and make art and all kinds of stuff.
There's some business cards by the door too.
And if you're able to stay for a moment, I encourage you to introduce yourself to somebody you don't know while you're here.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.